June 12, 1944, Normandy, France. A mechanic with a blowtorch was about to win the Battle of Normandy. The front had frozen. 6 days after D-Day, Allied armor was trapped not by enemy guns, but by farmland. Ancient hedgerows, some 15 feet thick, had turned every field into a fortress. Tanks that tried to climb them exposed their thin underbellies, and German Panzerfausts waited for that moment. One hit, one fireball. One crew gone. Colonels blamed terrain. Generals blamed weather. But one sergeant blamed geometry. His name was Curtis Culin, 102nd Cavalry Recon Squadron. New Jersey mechanic. No degree, no blueprint. Just nerve. He'd fixed engines in civilian garages before the war. Now he was watching Shermans die the same way over and over. And something in him refused to accept it. The problem, he realized, wasn't armor. It was angle. Tanks were trying to go over the hedgerows when they needed to go through them. He began sketching on scrap cardboard. Lines, prongs, leverage points. Culin's lost it, his crew joked. Gonna solve the war with doodles. But he kept drawing. Mechanics don't theorize, they see. And what he saw was simple. If steel teeth could bite into the earth and pull a tank forward flat, the Germans would never see its belly, and never get their kill shot. Culin went to his commanding officer, Captain Samuel Morrison, and proposed lunacy. Take a damaged Sherman. Weld 4 sharpened beams of scrap steel, cut from captured German beach obstacles called Czech hedgehogs, to its nose. Then drive it, full throttle, straight into a wall of dirt. Morrison stared. You want to ram a tank into a hedgerow on purpose? Yes, sir, Culin said. Better we hit it than it hits us. The captain hesitated, then nodded. You've got 48 hours. Prove it. Or we both explain this to angry generals. For 2 sleepless nights, torches hissed and sparks flew over a ruined tank. The men welded, ground, and cursed until 4 jagged prongs jutted forward like the tusks of a steel beast. When it rolled from the workshop, soldiers burst out laughing. Looks like a pig trying to mate with a porcupine. Culin just grinned. Then call it a pig. This one's rooting to Berlin. At dawn, the mad mechanic climbed onto the modified Sherman. 30 tons of armor met 10 centuries of Earth. And for the first time since D-Day, something finally broke. Not the tank. Dawn broke gray over the Norman fields. Mist clung to the hedgerows like smoke from invisible fires. Men gathered quietly in the cold, their breath rising as steam against the rising sun. In the center of the field stood Culin's strange creation. One Sherman tank with 4 steel tusks jutting from its nose. It looked absurd. Terrifying. Alive. Captain Samuel Morrison stood beside Culin, arms crossed, expression unreadable. You sure about this, Sergeant? No, sir, Culin replied. But the math is. The plan was simple and suicidal. They would ram a 12-foot hedgerow head-on. Inside the tank sat Corporal Jake Mitchell, driver, Sergeant Tom Harrison, gunner, and Private First Class Danny Chen, loader. Volunteers, all of them. If it blows up, Harrison joked, at least we'll die proving geometry. At Morrison's signal, the Sherman's engine rumbled to life. Black smoke curled from its exhaust. Culin stepped back, heart hammering in his chest. Every calculation, every weld, every sleepless hour would now collide with centuries of French soil. Hit it at 20 degrees, Culin shouted over the roar. Let the teeth bite first. Mitchell eased the throttle forward. The tank gathered speed, 10, 15, 20 miles an hour. The hedgerow loomed ahead, ancient roots twisting like veins of iron. The watching soldiers held their breath. Impact. The ground erupted. Roots snapped like rifle shots. The tank shuddered so hard it lifted its front tracks, but instead of rearing up, it dug in. The steel prongs tore through dirt and stone, cutting downward, not upward. The Sherman lurched, strained, then slowly pushed forward. The hedgerow cracked. A low groan echoed through the field as earth split apart under the tank's weight. Dust and leaves exploded skyward. The Great Wall of Normandy, unbroken since the Middle Ages, collapsed under 30 tons of American steel. Then, silence. A few seconds later, the Sherman burst through to the other side, its armor intact, its belly untouched. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then the cheering began. Dozens of men erupted at once, shouts, laughter, disbelief. The impossible had just happened before their eyes. Culin stood frozen, barely breathing. The sound of the tank's idling engine was the sweetest thing he'd ever heard. "It worked," he whispered. Captain Morrison turned toward him, eyes wide. "Sergeant, how many of these can you make?" Culin blinked. "With a few welders? 10 a day, maybe." "Not good enough," Morrison said, and smiled for the first time. "I'm sending word to headquarters. You're about to change this entire war." That afternoon, engineers swarmed the field, measuring angles, sketching diagrams. Within days, the design would be wired to General Omar Bradley's staff. The order came swiftly. 5,000 hedgerow cutters to be mounted on every available Sherman. From one mad idea came a revolution of steel. But Culin wasn't celebrating. He stared at the ruined hedgerow and whispered, "One test isn't combat. We still have to face the real thing." The next morning he would, under fire. Night fell heavy and cold. The test had proven the machine, but not the man. Sergeant Curtis Culin sat beside the modified Sherman, lantern light flickering over its steel tusks. He traced a finger along the weld seams, checking every joint for cracks. His hands were steady, but his mind was not. Tomorrow, the Rhinoceros, as the crew had nicknamed the tank, would lead an assault on a real German strongpoint. This time the hedgerows wouldn't be just dirt and roots. There would be mines, machine guns, and men waiting with Panzerfausts, patient and invisible. Private Danny Chen approached, carrying 2 tin mugs of coffee. "You should sleep, Sergeant." "Can't," Culin said, staring at the tank. "If the welds fail, it's on me." "They won't." "How do you know?" Chen shrugged. "Because you built it angry." "Angry things don't quit easy," Culin laughed quietly. Then his face hardened. "Tomorrow we find out if I got the math right, or if I just built a faster way to die." Dawn came gray again, with a mist that clung low over the fields. The plan was simple. Breach 3 hedgerows in succession and punch through to a German machine gun nest that had held the line for days. Infantry would follow close behind. The Rhinoceros led the column, its prongs dark with mud, its crew silent. Culin climbed into the commander's hatch to observe. The intercom crackled. "Ready when you are, Sergeant." "Hit it at 20 degrees again," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "Same bite angle as before. Keep your speed steady." The tank roared forward, treads biting into the damp soil. The first hedgerow loomed. Then impact. The earth split open. The Rhinoceros burst through as designed. Cheers erupted from the following infantry. But then, flashes. The first German shots cracked through the mist. A machine gun opened up from the next field. Dirt spat against the Sherman's hull. The Germans had seen the breach and were adjusting their aim. "Stay low!" Culin shouted. "Second hedgerow, go!" Mitchell gunned the engine. The tank lunged again, cutting into the next barrier. The prongs held. The machine groaned. Roots tore free. Culin's ears rang as bullets hammered the hull. Then something slammed against the side of the tank. An anti-tank round, glancing off the frontal armor with a deafening clang. Inside, Chen shouted, "We're good! Just a scratch!" Culin grabbed the periscope, scanning ahead. Through the smoke he saw movement. German soldiers scrambling behind their third hedgerow, setting up another shot. "Keep her straight," he yelled. "One more push." The Rhinoceros hit the last barrier like a living thing. Soil exploded outward. The tank broke through, muzzle already turning. The main gun fired, a single high-explosive shell that silenced the machine gun nest. When the smoke cleared, the men following behind were already pouring through the breaches, cheering as they advanced unopposed. Culin sank back in his seat, heart racing. It had worked again, under fire, under fear, under everything that should have stopped it. Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. "Congratulations, Sergeant. You just opened Normandy." Culin didn't smile. He just looked at the scorched earth ahead and said quietly, "No, sir. The men behind us did. I just gave them a door." Word of the rhinoceros traveled faster than any dispatch. By the next morning, engineers across Normandy were demanding the blueprints. Officers were sending runners to find the mechanic who cut through hell. The battlefield rumor spread like fire in dry grass. A Sherman had gone through 3 hedgerows under fire and come out clean. General Omar Bradley read the report twice before asking, "Who the hell is Sergeant Culin?" When the answer came back, "A mechanic from New Jersey," he just nodded, then put that mechanic in charge of production. Orders went out within hours. Every available tank in the 1st and 3rd Armies was to receive the modification immediately. Workshops from Cherbourg to Saint-Lô turned into foundries of sparks and steel. Welders scavenged every scrap of metal they could find, destroyed landing craft, wrecked obstacles, even twisted beams from German fortifications. By July 10, 1944, over 500 Shermans had been fitted with Culin's cutters. A week later, there were thousands. The soldiers called them rhinos. The name stuck. From the air, they looked like steel beasts charging through hedgerows in formation, tusks glinting in the sun. Wherever they appeared, the front moved forward. Roads that had been static for weeks now flowed with armor and infantry. Villages long marked impassable were suddenly open. The Germans were caught off guard. Their tactics, ambush, fire, retreat, collapsed when the Americans no longer stopped at the hedges. One German report recovered near Saint-Lô simply read, "Enemy tanks now pass through walls." Impossible to predict direction of attack. The transformation was staggering. Before the Rhino tanks, the Allied advance in Normandy averaged 100 yards a day. After Culin's invention spread, that figure jumped to 2 miles daily. The hedgerows that had once been fortresses were now doors, each one ripped open by fire and steel. Culin watched from the sidelines as his design multiplied beyond his control. His workshop became a constant roar of acetylene torches and shouted orders. Men he'd never met worked from his sketches, building devices by the hundreds. His own hands were blistered raw, but he refused rest. "Every cutter is another tank that doesn't burn," he told his crew. When General Bradley finally visited the field shop, he asked Culin if he understood what he'd done. "No, sir," Culin said honestly. "I just fixed what was broken." Bradley smiled. "You fixed the whole front." By the time Operation Cobra launched on July 25th, 60% of American tanks in Normandy carried the Rhino modification. As they smashed through German lines west of Saint-Lô, the sound was like thunder rolling through the hedgerows, each tank tearing open another path, infantry flooding behind. The countryside that had once consumed entire battalions now fell in hours. For the first time since D-Day, the Allies were advancing faster than the Germans could retreat. Culin's invention hadn't just solved a tactical problem. It had unleashed momentum, and momentum wins wars. But every advance brings a shadow. The faster they moved, the more they saw what the hedgerows had hidden. The breakthrough came faster than anyone imagined, and faster than anyone could control. What had been a slow, grinding crawl through the hedgerows of Normandy became a thunderous flood of armor. The Rhino tanks tore the countryside apart, hedges vanishing in clouds of dust and smoke. But behind every shattered wall lay something no blueprint had accounted for. Bodies, civilians, horses still harnessed to shattered wagons. The hedgerows had hidden not only German defenses, but lives. By the third day of the breakout, the fields of St. Lo were burning. The air smelled of diesel and clay, gunpowder and earth. The rhinos were unstoppable, but the war that followed their path was chaos. Communications lagged, units overlapped. Friendly fire incidents rose as tanks burst through walls into friendly lines. Sergeant Curtis Culin rode in the lead tank of one column, his invention now replicated on every vehicle around him. What had started as a single welding job had become a moving army of monsters, snorting smoke, ripping the land apart with every charge. Inside the cramped tank, Corporal Mitchell broke the silence. "Feels different, doesn't it?" "Not like the test." "Not clean." Cullen nodded slowly. "It's working too well." The rhinoceros was doing its job too efficiently. German resistance collapsed in pockets, but the cost of speed was confusion. Tanks raced ahead of infantry. Roads clogged with wrecks, prisoners, and refugees. Somewhere in the chaos, the line between victory and destruction blurred. That night, rain fell hard. The men of the 102nd huddled under ponchos beside their tanks. Through the darkness, Culin could hear the engines idling in the distance. Hundreds of them, his design multiplied into a mechanical storm. He thought about the men who'd died before the cutter existed, trapped and burned in their tanks. He'd built this to save them, but as he watched the horizon glow red from burning villages, he wondered what his invention had unleashed. Captain Morrison found him standing in the mud. "You should be proud, Sergeant. Bradley says we'll be in Avranches by week's end. The Germans can't stop us now." Culin didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the burning fields. "They said the hedgerows were ancient," he murmured. "Took farmers centuries to build them. We tore them down in days." "That's war," Morrison said. "Maybe," Culin replied, "but somebody's got to remember what it cost." When dawn came, the tanks rolled out again. The cutters bit into the wet earth, throwing up curtains of mud. Every roar of their engines felt heavier now, every breakthrough less like triumph and more like penance. War is a machine, Culin thought, and machines don't stop once they start working. They called him a hero now. Headquarters wanted photographs, newspapers wanted names, and commanders wanted speeches. But Sergeant Curtis Culin, the grease-stained mechanic from New Jersey, wanted none of it. When the breakout from Normandy reached Avranches, he was summoned to meet General Omar Bradley himself. The general's tent was clean, orderly, far from the mud and stench of the front. Culin stood awkwardly before the brass, his uniform still streaked with oil. Bradley looked up from a field report and smiled. "Sergeant, you just changed how we fight wars. Eisenhower saw your design this morning. He wants 5,000 more." Culin blinked, not sure how to respond. "Sir, it wasn't strategy. It was just a fix." Bradley nodded. "That's exactly what war needs. People who fix what's broken." The words should have filled him with pride. Instead, they felt heavy. Outside, a jeep waited to take him back to the front. The driver, a young private, grinned and said, "Heard they're calling your tanks Culin cutters. You're famous, Sarge." Culin just shook his head. "Fame's for people who get things right the first time. I just got lucky on the 5th try." That night, as he rode back toward St. Lo, the landscape looked different. The hedgerows, those ancient green barriers that had once stopped entire armies, were gone, flattened, torn. What had been the face of Normandy was now a scar stretching to the horizon. The destruction wasn't just physical. Every breakthrough left its echo. Farmers returning to find their fields plowed into trenches, homes shattered by the fighting that followed the rhinos' advance. The men didn't talk about it, but Culin felt it pressing on all of them. The strange truth that victory and ruin looked the same from up close. In the weeks that followed, his cutters became standard issue. Welders worked day and night. Factory lines back in England stamped out pre-cut prongs in batches of hundreds. Manuals were printed. The invention that began as a pencil sketch on a ration box became part of official doctrine. Culin device, M4 modification. When a correspondent asked him how it felt to save the Normandy campaign, Culin paused for a long moment before answering. "I didn't save it," he said finally. "The men who drove those tanks did. I just gave them a way through." It was the closest he ever came to a public statement. Months later, when the Allies crossed the Seine and the war moved east toward Germany, reports noted that nearly every tank in the European theater carried some version of his design. But to Culin, it was still just metal and welds, a thing built to solve a problem. What it became was something he hadn't foreseen. Proof that one man with no rank, no title, and one crazy idea could alter the course of history. And yet, he couldn't shake the thought that every wall his invention tore down had once belonged to someone. July 25, 1944. Saint-Lô, France. The morning sky pulsed with light before the sound reached the ground. Over 1,500 American bombers filled the horizon, carpeting the German defenses with thunder. Below them, lines of Sherman tanks waited, each one bristling with steel prongs that gleamed in the haze. Every crew knew what came next, the signal for Operation Cobra. When the last explosions faded, the fields ahead were black and smoking. The hedgerows that had once swallowed Allied armor were gone, or about to be. Engines roared to life. The rhinos advanced. From the ridge, Sergeant Curtis Culin watched the column move. Row after row of tanks, his tanks, plunged through what had once been the impossible. No halts, no bottlenecks, no cries for engineers. Each machine simply lowered its steel tusks and tore into the earth. In one morning, the front that had held for 50 days shattered. The Americans punched a hole 5 miles wide through the German line west of Saint-Lô. Infantry poured through behind them, followed by artillery and supply trucks. For the first time since D-Day, the map itself began to change faster than headquarters could redraw it. General Omar Bradley stood at his command post near Le Mesnil-Herman, radio pressed to his ear, listening as reports came in. "Cobra has broken loose," one commander said. "We're through. We're in open country." Bradley turned to his staff. "Tell the men to keep going. Don't stop for anything." By nightfall, American armor had advanced more than 6 miles, a speed unthinkable just a month earlier. The German 7th Army, its defensive grid built around the hedgerows, began to collapse in confusion. Their anti-tank teams found no cover. Their ambushes no longer worked. "The enemy tanks move through earth like water," one captured officer wrote in disbelief. Culin, still a sergeant, stood beside his own Sherman at dusk. The air was thick with dust and the smell of fuel. Beyond the horizon, the front was breaking open like a dam giving way. "Looks like it worked, Sarge," said Private Chen, wiping grime from his face. Culin watched the endless line of moving rhinos and said quietly, "It wasn't supposed to work this well." He meant it. The speed of the advance terrified him. The front that had once moved in feet was now measured in miles. Tanks outpaced their fuel trucks, infantry lost sight of their armor, and radio lines crackled with confusion. Victory had its own momentum, and no one knew where it would stop. By the end of July, the German defenses in Normandy had collapsed entirely. The breakout surged toward Avranches, and within days, Patton's Third Army poured through the gap, sweeping across Brittany and into the heart of France. Newspapers called it the miracle at Saint-Lô. Commanders called it the Culin breakthrough. Culin called it something else when asked by a war correspondent that week. "Just physics, sir. Physics and desperation." August 1944. France was no longer a battlefield. It was a scar stretching from the beaches of Normandy to the gates of Paris. What the maps showed as liberated territory looked, up close, like ruin stitched together with triumph. The hedgerows were gone, shredded, burned, bulldozed flat by the very machines that had once died trying to cross them. Towns like Saint-Lô, Coutances, and Avranches were reduced to rubble and smoke. Yet, through that devastation, Allied columns poured forward unopposed. The Rhino tanks had done their job. The Germans were in retreat. France was opening like a wound that finally drained. Sergeant Curtis Culin stood on a ridge outside a shattered Norman village, watching a convoy rumble past. The fields were torn and black. A week earlier, this had been the German front line. Now, farmers were already returning, moving cautiously through craters and twisted wire, leading the same horses that had once pulled German guns. A French woman approached him, a child at her side. She said something in a trembling voice he barely understood. Then she touched the side of his tank, the welded prongs still streaked with mud, and nodded once in silent thanks. Cullen didn't know what to say. Back at headquarters, General Bradley mentioned him in dispatches. Reporters wrote about the mechanic who saved the Normandy campaign. One article even suggested he'd shortened the war by months. The army awarded him the Legion of Merit. When the medal was pinned to his chest, he looked uncomfortable, like a man being thanked for fixing a leak while the house still burned. That night, in his tent, he opened his notebook, the same one where he'd drawn the first sketches, and wrote just one line. Every machine solves one problem and creates another. He closed it, then tucked it away. By September, the Allies were advancing across the Seine. The need for hedgerow cutters faded as the terrain changed. The invention that had defined the summer of '44 was already being replaced by new problems: fuel shortages, river crossings, urban combat. Culin's name disappeared from daily reports as quickly as it had appeared. Yet his idea lingered in every field they passed. Each gap in the Norman hedgerows, each open road, was a reminder of the moment when the impossible became possible. When the war finally ended, and Culin returned home to New Jersey, he was offered promotions, interviews, even a factory position designing armored vehicles. He declined most of it. "I'm not an inventor," he told a reporter. "Just a mechanic who got tired of watching good men die the same way twice." He never spoke of it again. But in France, farmers still pointed to the strange, squared gaps carved into the earth, and said quietly, "Les Américains ont passé ici." The Americans passed here. History remembers the big moves, armies, offensives, generals. But it's the small ones that change the shape of the world. Curtis Culin's idea began as a sketch in the mud, and within a month, it had reshaped a continent. When the U.S. Army historians compiled their report on the Normandy campaign in 1945, the hedgerow cutter earned a single paragraph. An improvised field device, devised by Sergeant C. Culin, enabled armored units to pass through bocage with greatly increased efficiency. Just one paragraph. No photographs, no fanfare. But between those lines lived thousands of lives that might have been lost. Men who reached Paris, who came home because one sergeant refused to quit thinking. Back home, Culin returned to his garage in New Jersey. He fixed cars again, engines that sputtered, gears that jammed, clutches that refused to engage. To his neighbors, he was just Kurt. To the army, he was a name in a file. But to the soldiers who'd driven the rhinos through Normandy, he was something else entirely. Letters found him over the years. Grease-smudged, folded, simple. "Your cutter saved my crew. We made it home because of that thing you built." He kept them in a small box, never mentioning them to anyone. Sometimes, late at night, he'd reopen his old field notebook. The sketches were still there, the crude lines, the angle marks, the first spark of a miracle born from frustration. At the bottom of one page, in faded pencil, was a sentence he'd written the morning after the test. Maybe the simplest tools are the most human. He thought about that often. How war reduces everything to function, yet meaning always sneaks back in. A welding torch, a scrap of steel, a stubborn idea. All instruments of destruction. Yet in his hands, they'd become something that saved men. By the time the 1950s came, the Army had new tanks, new doctrines, new wars. Culin's name wasn't in the manuals anymore, but in Normandy, the field still bore his signature. Straight scars through old hedgerows, lines where the earth had once yielded to fire and will. Standing there years later, veterans would point and tell their sons, "That's where we finally broke out." They never said who made it possible. They didn't need to. The land itself remembered. In the end, Culin's invention wasn't about the cutter at all. It was about what happens when an ordinary man sees a dead end and refuses to accept it. June 6th, years later. The wind moved gently across the fields of Normandy. Sunlight spilled through the gaps where hedgerows once stood. Thin lines of wildflowers marking where tanks had once torn the earth apart. Tourists came with cameras. Veterans came with silence. And every so often, a farmer would point toward an oddly squared gap in a hedge and say softly, "Les Américains ont passé ici." The Americans passed here. They didn't know the name Curtis Culin. They didn't need to. His work was in the land itself, invisible, enduring. The scars his machines carved had long healed into meadows and fields. But beneath the grass, the earth still remembered the shock of steel and fire. The hedgerow cutter never sat in a museum. No plaque, no polished display. Just a few rusted prongs in a field depot somewhere, forgotten by history but not by time. Yet its impact was everywhere. In the survival of an army, in the speed of liberation, in the simple proof that innovation doesn't come from orders. It comes from people. Culin's story became legend only among the men who'd seen it firsthand. They'd tell it in barracks, in pubs, at reunions decades later. About the sergeant with the crazy idea who welded victory out of scrap metal. The brass thought he was nuts, they'd say, laughing. Turns out, he was just right early. Back home, Culin lived quietly, never writing a memoir or chasing recognition. He passed away in 1963, his name known mostly to military engineers, and a handful of men who still remembered what it felt like to see a tank break through a wall that no one thought could fall. But legacies don't live in headlines. They live in the shift of possibility, the invisible moment when someone proves that impossible things can, in fact, be done. Culin's invention didn't just open a path through Normandy. It opened a truth that outlasts every war. That courage isn't always loud. That genius doesn't always wear rank. And that sometimes the most extraordinary victories begin with the quiet defiance of an ordinary man holding a welding torch. He was a mechanic, not a general. But when history's great machine stalled, he was the one who made it move again.